Welcome to another edition of Influence Today with Chet, Tart, and Terry Lyles. We have a special guest today, Alex Cooke from Optimist Capital. And what we're going to talk today about is the economy. Terry, welcome. Glad you're with us again today. Let's talk about how to become invaluable in the stock market. You know, we just went through a situation, Alex, with the debt ceiling. Maybe you can explain a little bit about it, because as I talk to people, they don't really know what it is, how it affects us, and how we could fix it so quickly. Or did we?
It's never truly fixed. The debt ceiling is in the way the government is set up. There is a cap in how much debt the government can take on. And there is no permanent open door to that. And what I mean by that is you can't just keep taking on debt, and letting it ride. So they have this ceiling where that's the maximum amount of debt that the US government is allowed to take on. And the problem to that is it's a hard and fast number. So it doesn't take in things like inflation, things like that. So naturally, over time, you have more dollars in the system that are worth less, and that hard and fast number is not as functional. Because, let's just use a random number. Let's say the debt ceiling was $5 million in 1960. That would have seemed like an insurmountable number. $5 million today is maybe worth the equivalent of, one on those numbers. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is we do sometimes issue more debt than we probably should to pay for certain things. So it does creep up both ways, inflation and issuing of debt. The first thing to know about the debt ceiling, though, is it typically is it's the same idea as a credit card scenario. We typically pay back on our debt by issuing treasury bills, things like that, and rolling it into new debt. It's just the way things have always been done. And the debt is usually capped at a certain level of GDP. And over time, it has increased. Certain presidencies and have brought it back down and controlled it differently. The general way to look at it is this is not the debt from here and now. It is the debt most likely from a couple of years ago that has come due. It's your payments due. Think of it as like the balloon payment on interest rate mortgage or something, where you now have to pay a big chunk, and it's due today for something you got 2-3 years ago. Typically, the debt ceiling is 2 years trailing. So most of this debt is from the previous presidency, not the current. Current presidency is creating debt for the next few years.
That's good to know. That's really good to know.
Well, most people are unaware that the presidential policies take so much time to enact that it typically takes 2 years into the next presidency before that particular president's policies actually have an effect. So what I'm saying, in other words, is the last 2 years could be applicable more to Trump than to Biden. But the next 2 years would be applicable to Biden because his policies would be really starting to take effect. Same would go for the first 2 years, the Trump presidency. That would have been more applicable to Obama. Make sense? It's just the simple timing of things. You can't, government and the amount of money and things, it just doesn't move that fast. So when you enact something, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over 18 months. So that's just a simple thing to note. So these debts obviously are from previous. There's always a cap. Congress is allowed to raise the cap. They can move it up, but it's always a kicking the can down the field situation, because we will hit the cap again in a couple more years. It's just inflation changes things, and it's just going to happen again. And in the last few times that we've gotten to raising it, it's pretty common that both sides want as much TV time as possible. So they tend to push this to the last minute. be honest with you, I had no doubt that this was going to pass. It would be so bad if it didn't. That, you know, I know there are some people that were say, well, let's do it, let's make it happen. I assure you, those were not the adults in the room, because that would have been one of the worst possible things you could have done. You know, have downgrading our debt not only would risk us as the de facto currency, but it risks us outside, because other countries then start saying, well, why should I be holding UST bills? Why should I be aligned with them? They can't even control their own economy. You know, so there's so many, you know, issues there. So
Let me ask you a quick question
yes.
on like retirement or somebody. I have a client who just sold a business,
Mhm.
and they come into a large chunk of capital. I mean, what do you do with it? I mean, you don't have to go into too much detail if you don't want to, but I mean,
No,
like,
I can give the absolute answer at this point in time. So although we still have investments in the direct market, we're operating at about 50-50, some cases 60-40, to the risk averse side. And what that means is we've seen the bond market show signs of life, really only in the short term. So we're buying T-bills for our cash on the side to, you know, protect from risk and ride things out a bit. And we've been getting 3 months at 5.25 to, you know, 5.4%. That's the basis of risk-free money. So essentially, at this moment in time, that is literally what we consider the best case scenario. Now, we don't pull everything out of the market. We've, you know, hold other things, because you never do that. You miss out on dividends and things like that. But when you're moving to safety in a time of questionable risk, if you have a alternate investment like that, that's typically where you go. One of the reasons why the stock market did so well over the last 10 years, up until beginning of roughly a year ago when it peaked out, was mostly that there was no other options. The fixed income market had no value. So why would you put your money in something that pays you nothing, when growth was, you know, all over the place and markets were moving up? So the obvious choice was the markets. The problem you have now is you don't really have the same growth factors. You have the Fed raising interest rates, and you have these short-term T-bills paying 5%. So the debate becomes, what amount of return do you want to be willing to take on risk, knowing that without any risk, you can get 5%. So zero risk is 5%. So what's your number? And the life of the equity markets, long-term life net of fees, is typically somewhere around 7%. Okay.
yeah.
So that's
That
a long, you know, that's 100 years. So add that 2% to that 5, and know that the minute you step into the equity over the T-bill, you are taking risk, because the odds of that 7, it's an odd scenario. It's not a guarantee. It maybe in this market right now, it's a 60-40 scenario, 40% chance you're, you know, down around 1-2%, or, you know, negative 60% chance you actually get to that 7%. Year to date, the markets have been up. They're up around 9% or so, roughly. But the question is, are you really willing to take that risk for that number when you have just an absolute guaranteed zero risk? So essentially, you're going from no risk, risk-free, not even calculate, it is no risk, to limitless risk. Because when you buy into the equity side, there is risk, and you came from an absolute no risk scenario.
Right.
And the answer
gold and silver. I mean, I have people ask me this all the time. Like, do you pull a Brinks truck up to my house? I mean, what do I do? So there's, you know, and I counsel people, you know, on the performance side, but then I also consult with business owners of all sizes. And I'm like, well, I'll connect you to somebody like Alex. You know, I know a guy kind of thing.
I got a guy in here, John, who cracks me up, because he's the gold and silver pitch, and that's our constant battle. He's gold and silver. He thinks it's great. lifetime of gold, these T-bill numbers will beat it percentage wise. So
Mhm.
that for right here and now, lifetime different story, but for right here and now, the T-bills will do better. But
Gotcha.
the gold, look, it is a safe type of investment, but it still carries some risk. Everything that is non-risk free, basically, which is anything else, does carry some risk. And I always use the explanation with the gold and silver of this. Okay. If you really believe that the sky is falling, end of the world, and you're putting your money into gold and silver because you think that that's going to protect you, well, I would tell you you're 100% wrong, because then there's no need for the whole economy. And are you going to show up with a rock and try and trade with a farmer for some food? He's going to say, what the hell do I do with this rock?
Right.
So the reality is, in that scenario where you think it's just, the absolute worst case, which is typically when people buy gold and silver, the reality is, you need to have a skill, not a rock. And the other thing is, you can't technically even hold gold in certain forms, so it has to be stored somewhere. How are you going to access it? I mean, there's all these other
If it's still
issues.
yours, it's like the stock market. I've got it in a vault somewhere in Cincinnati, or I'm like, I've never seen it. It's on paper.
Exactly. It's all this. And the other fact you have to believe there is, if that really is the path we're headed, then what's the point of any of this? So my ultimate view is I don't see a real value in gold and silver ever, purely from the fact that it would basically mean markets are pointless, I'm pointless. You see?
That's all. I'll let Chet jump in, because I don't want to dominate this, but I'll leave this with Chet. So I'm assuming you believe in diversification, though, right? You need to have diverse.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. And I'm not, and don't get me wrong. If you want to, own some gold, I mean, we have people with some gold. Like I said, I have this debate with John. So, we get some here and there, but I'm not a proponent of it, because I've always found that there's better options out there. And the fact is, since gold and silver is supposed to be on the basis that you're physically holding it, and you can't really do that in the quantities that would be of any use,
right,
kind of defeats the purpose, so.
Okay, Chet, you baby, go.
Alex, I was thinking, I listen to a lot of pundits, and there's a gentleman I listened to from the Garmin report, and he was talking about the end of this year, and 2024 looks even better. Could you give us a little insight on the rest of this year, and what are the indicators for 2024, and how does this increase of interest rates, how does that going to affect us and what we do?
Well, let's go first with the fact that the unemployment numbers were so good today, and they were so good that the Fed is probably going to continue to raise rates. So rates are going higher. Bond markets, which value,
how high can it go, Alex? How high can it go?
That's not something I can give you an answer
Can
on.
we go back to the Carter days? Can it go that high?
Is it, anything is possible? Do I think that that's probable? Not likely.
No.
But, let's start with the mortgage. Okay. So mortgage rates have been crazy low numbers. If you have a 3% mortgage right now, you would be a fool to refinance, and you would be a fool to buy it out. You should keep that mortgage for its absolute life, because that rate is never coming back. Not in your lifetime, not in my lifetime. So the fact is, mortgages, realistically, the rate should be somewhere around 8%. Okay. This is perfect world. Nothing's ever perfect, but let's just do it from valuation standpoint. Perfect world, a mortgage should be 8%. The reason for that is because the mortgage should be just expensive enough to not make you want to pull money out of your house to go invest it somewhere else. And at the same time, not too expensive to make it impossible for people to buy. So 8% is right around where that number is, because realistically, as I said, equity markets are typically 7%. So you wouldn't pull equity from your house to invest in the equity markets, because you'd be losing. Now, few years back, people were doing just this because, you pull $500,000 out of your house and you could look at a 12, 13% average return in markets for a year here and there. That's a no-brainer. And the same with the T-bills right now. If you have a mortgage at 3%, the T-bill's paying you 5.25%, you can turn a profit.
Mm-hmm.
Those days are gone. They're not likely coming back. But the fact is, this all lines up with that the current generation has never seen interest rates like you were referring to with Carter. They have no idea, that mortgages could be 15 to 18% back in the 80s. All right. And so it's unfathomable that I would say that 8% is the sweet spot. I mean, that's to people like that. Oh, that's a huge rate. That's amazing. It's incredible. It'll kill me. I said, well, yeah, but the fact is that's where it realistically should be. Not to mention the property values moving the way they have probably shouldn't have moved as high as they have too. Everything should be moderate in real estate, mortgages, etc. But you had a zero rate environment, extremely low mortgages, so people were incentivized to pay more for houses because more free money. So it pushed everything up, and it's causing a definite change right now. We're not seeing it as much in our area, but the rest of the country is already seeing cooling off of housing prices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a question.
What about the future? Yeah,
answer.
what about our future? How do you see the end of 2023 for us?
So we have this, the debt ceiling has moved forward, so that's great for the moment. I still don't see anything that is a catalyst for true growth. I mean, we've seen little signs of life here and there with certain things. As many know, the AI area has kind of taken off with Chet GPT, which is Microsoft, and some of the hardware, which is NVIDIA. NVIDIA really, did very well over the last few weeks, and continues to. So there's always signs of life in certain areas, but these are a few big players. You got to remember the equity markets are thousands of securities. So even though we're seeing the S&P and a few of these things creep up and move upwards, it's only being driven by a few select stocks. It's not being driven by the whole.
No.
And that's not a good sign. You need you can't have just a few entities driving everything. It has to be a majority. It doesn't have to be everyone, but it has to be a majority for things to really be looking good. So from that standpoint, where is the ongoing growth? And let's just go back to the mortgage and interest rates for a second. Growth companies come in with some sort of an idea, but they need to fund that idea. How do they fund that idea? They take loans. The loans become more expensive. They take less money. There's less likely that they're able to grow their product, their entity, etc. So again, that is a weakening of growth right there. So there's all these factors that just come into place, not to mention that the employment numbers, the way they're spiking up here, that's usually a sign that we're at or very near the peak of the economy, because that's typically a factor that is leading the other direction at some point fairly soon. So the debt ceiling being done means that a nasty recession is off the table, in my view. That if that had been done, we would have really been in for some real mess of a recession. But recession's not off the table, because the fact is there's no ongoing factors for growth. So now we look at it more. Remember, they talked about a soft and hard landing. People heard that phrase said everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere.
I would like to believe at this point that the hard landing's pretty much over, but that doesn't mean recession is not coming. And the thing is, a lot of this stuff is lining up. I'll give you a little funny side factor. Costco and Macy's put out their signs of why they see things coming on the horizon. So Costco sees over their lifetime, they've seen changes in trends in what people buy when they know things are on the horizon. So interestingly enough, there's been a huge cutback on beef and switch to more chicken and pork, which are much cheaper to purchase. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but Costco has this as one of their factors that they've shown over time to be fairly accurate, that the consumer just change. They don't necessarily change where they buy, they change what they buy. And they also, the other thing is they tend to buy more canned things that can last longer in a pantry. And they're seeing an uptick in this. Macy's is seeing a change in clothing buying, which is another factor, because people start buying less fancy dresses, things like that, and more standard stuff that tends to last few years and can be worn more consistently. Suits, pants, you know where I'm going with that, more consistent stuff. Whereas, you know, the fancy dress, which tends to be the one-off because the women only wear it to one event, that tends to cut back substantially in these scenarios. So these things are starting to happen, which are just, you know, all these things come together, and it just is signs that we're headed towards some sort of a recession. But again, I don't believe it's a nasty one anymore, but I do see it on the horizon. I do see it coming. I just don't see, and I can't quantify any way we can establish more growth when the Fed is trying to raise rates. And when they're trying to raise rates to bring down inflation, you know that it's eventually going to affect employment, because it has to, because it's just the reality of it.
Interesting. No, that's a good.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Alex. I appreciate the insight. I'd like to have you back again. I'd like you to talk a little bit about something that is new for you, but at the same time, eye-opening. You got into politics, and now you're a mayor. Now, I'd love to know the insight, and we'll keep that later, of what the political arena is like and how it has affected you. We'll do that again in another episode. All right.
Sounds good. All I can
Alex,
say is
how do we
it's
reach
very
you?
different.
I'm sure it is. Yeah. How do we reach you? If someone wants to reach out to you with your expertise and your wisdom and all that, how do they reach you?
Oh, I'm very accessible. Optimistcap.com, optimistcap.com, and my email's on there. You'll find me on there. You can also get me at alexander-cook.com. And our phone number here, my direct line, 203-724-0098, and that is at Optimist Capital.
Nice.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Appreciate that. Thank you, Terry, for being on. And thanks for another edition of Influence Today.
Thank you, Chet. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.